Okay, meaning. Let's talk about meaning. So meaning is really the bigger picture and the value and worth of what you're doing. And for some people, it's sort of the purpose in life. A lot of people really connect with what they do in their work lives and what that means for the purpose of their overall lives, right? So for me, for instance, I work at Google, I work in public cloud, and I do think a lot about the societal impact that this can have if we do it right. It impacts a lot of businesses and governments, and we really have a lot of responsibility, and to me that is meaningful, right? Another thing that is meaningful to me personally is that I am a relatively rare female leader in technology, and I want to show up as sort of a living, breathing example. And I've gotten, from other people, from sort of the younger generation behind me, that this makes a difference for them. So to me, this is meaningful. So that's the kind of stuff we're talking about here. So meaning, sometimes people also call it purpose. How do you find purpose in work? And how does that contribute to the overall feeling that you have? So here's where we get to talk about job crafting, which you may have heard about before. So job crafting is this idea that within a certain role, there's actually quite a bit of leeway of what you focus on, right? So you can sort of think of jobs as this, or your role on a spectrum, right? So there's a job, which is you show up and make money. There's a career, which is like, you do it so that you can further yourself and benefit society. And then there's calling on the extreme side, which is sort of the canonical examples are doctors, nurses, priests, and so forth. And so it's like along the spectrum that everybody falls somewhere along the spectrum when you ask them about their job. And job crafting is this idea that there is a correlation between, priests tend to be more high on the calling side, but it is not by any stretch a perfect correlation. So, for instance, you find janitors that will fall anywhere on the spectrum, right? And the idea is that within your job, what are the things that are meaningful to you? So I talked about a couple of things. For me, mentoring is very meaningful, right? And being able to focus and put some energy into that in my job is very, very meaningful. So what the research shows basically is when you challenge people to think about how do I craft my job and my role to make it more meaningful, they actually become much more productive and not just happier, but productive in their jobs. So one thing I also wanted to mention is, actually, let's just go back here. One thing I did want to mention here that I forgot to mention is Daniel Pink wrote this book, Drive: The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us. If you haven't read it, I can highly recommend it. It goes at a lot of those same things. And he talks about what motivates people, and he talks about purpose as being one of those. So purpose is, again, the same thing about what is the deeper meaning that you're getting after. Okay, PERMA. Accomplishments. So this is our last axis here. So accomplishments, again, this might seem a little bit backward to you, okay, if I have accomplishments, then I will be successful. That seems kind of, circular. So accomplishments, yes, could be outward accomplishments, like getting promoted, having, landing an important project, getting a degree, whatever it may be. But it can also mean the idea of mastery. So this is when you read about this, what people often talk about is focus on mastering a skill, not just about the outward accolades from other people, right? And that actually, you feeling that you master a skill is more important actually. Again, Daniel Pink in that book that I just mentioned that's called Drive talks about mastery as another big predictor of how motivated people are. So it all kind of starts coming together, right? Because this idea of you master a skill, it puts you in a place where you feel better about what you're doing. It makes you more motivated, and that obviously makes you more, better at your job and do more things. So that's really important. So one of the, or a couple of the techniques here to reach mastery really go back to what we were talking about in the flow section, right? So break down the problem, make sure you're kind of pushed out of your comfort zone. You're definitely not in the boredom zone, but also not in the anxiety zone, and then you can kind of practice and improve your skills. One thing to be very careful of here, and this really goes back to not focusing on the external accomplishments, is this concept of the hedonic treadmill that you may have heard about. What it essentially means is that you think, oh, I just want to get this promotion, or I just want to land this one thing, and then I'll be happy. And that's just not how it works. There's ample evidence that this is not how it works. You get there and you're like, yes, I did it, and then somewhere between 5 minutes and 3 months later, you're like, okay, what's next, right? So it just keeps going and going and going. And really the way out of this, again, is to emphasize the intrinsic growth and not the external accomplishments as much. This might sound hard, but that's how it works. One of the things that I do, I can tell you what I do because I've fallen prey to this, is I decide ahead of time what's good enough, right? So I decide ahead of time. So one of the things I like to do is I like to run. I've run a couple of marathons, and now my daughter is like, okay, Mom, when are you gonna qualify for Boston? Boston, for those of you who don't know, is a marathon that you have to qualify for with a specific time. I'm far away from that. And I decided, this is not my goal. I'm just not gonna, maybe I could do it, I don't know, maybe. But it is not my goal, and I'm not going to be unhappy about my accomplishments just because there's yet another thing that I could be doing, because trust me, there's always one more thing that you could be doing. So kind of thinking about it this way has helped me. Maybe it'll help you too. Okay, so we've talked a lot about what are the kinds of things that set you up for success. As I'd mentioned now a couple of times, eating healthy, sleeping well, exercising, meditating are all things that will do that. So, okay, but in order to do that, people come to me and they're like, well, I need willpower to do that. I don't have the willpower to get out of bed in the morning. So, it's kind of, okay, so what do we do about that? Turns out that willpower is also something that can be learned. And this is, I think I have it on the next slide, but I'll give you another book recommendation. It's called The Willpower Instinct. It is fabulous. It's a really great book. I really enjoy it. And it was written by somebody who teaches a community, open to the community class at Stanford. And they basically try out all these techniques that are backed by science. And again, not everything works for everybody, but it's really a fun read and a fabulous book to try out for yourself. One of the key takeaways is that willpower is like a muscle, just like everything else. You can train it, you can get better by it. It gets exhausted, but over the course of the day, you will run out of willpower. I can attest to this. But over time, you can train it as well. So here's the book reference, The Willpower Instinct. Cannot recommend it enough. Really had a lot of fun reading it. So what do you do in order to train your willpower, right? So again, you want to train your willpower so you can get out of bed and exercise and meditate and things like that so you can be more successful. This is great. So make sure you have the environment set up properly so that you can focus, you get good sleep. And then some of the things that she talks about are really interesting. Basically, if you want to build a good habit, then make sure that the activation energy is low. So people say if they have trouble getting out of bed in the morning to go exercise, they sleep in their exercise clothes, because then you wake up and you stand up and you put your shoes on and you go out. So, okay, that could work. Conversely, if there's something that you don't want to do, then put off bad habits for 10 minutes. She calls this pause and plan. So if you're tempted by the chocolate cake that is probably going to sit in front of me at some point today, I should sit back and wait for 10 minutes, and then somehow that puts us in a place where we can say no better. One of the favorite things in this book that I read is called the what the hell effect. I don't know if this is an American expression. I'll ask you later about this. But what it means is that if you're having a bad day, let's say you're trying to eat healthy, okay? And then you have lunch, and you eat maybe a little bit too much, and then you have dessert, and then you're like, okay, maybe just one more cookie, and then you get to a point where you're like, well, obviously this day is a bad day, and it cannot be salvaged. So this is called the what the hell effect, and then you just let go of the day, and then it just gets worse and worse. And I'm like, I'm not alone, okay? Other people feel this too. So I definitely have that, and what she basically says in this book is, number one, you're not alone, and this happens to everyone. Number two is the people that actually have the highest willpower are the ones that forgive themselves and say, no, actually, it's okay that I had this many cookies, and now we move forward from there, and not fall prey to this. So that's, I think about this all the time. What the hell effect? You can't unthink it. Okay, so let me just close by saying, when I started preparing for this talk, this was sort of the culmination of a lot of things that I had read over the years and applied and learned. But one of the things that I had never done consistently at all is meditation, okay? And I will be very truthful with you, I still don't. But as I was preparing for this talk, I'm like, okay, now I've read it a million times, I guess I should try to figure out how to meditate. So I did, and I'm a very stubborn person, so I'm like, okay, I'm going to meditate every day for at least 5 minutes, which is not a lot, for 3 months, every single day. And I'm the kind of person where I need to keep the streak going, because once the streak is broken, it doesn't go again. So I did that. And I use a fitness tracker, so I used a proxy. So this is what I found. My stress score did go down a little bit, and my sleep score did go up a little bit during that time. Look, I have no idea. This is obviously a completely unscientific study. There's a lot of things. We have an N count of 1. There's a lot of other things that went on in my life during that period of time. It's not bad, I have to admit that afterwards, I was exactly the thing you shouldn't do. I got very busy, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to stop for a little while, and I'm trying to pick it back up again. Like I said, just like many of us, I'm still on this journey. But it was an interesting experiment, and I guess if there's one thing I will say is it convinced me that it's worth giving it a serious try for me, right? Even for me, who's been a skeptic for many, many years. One thing that I can't tell you is how did this impact my work life, right? I didn't see any obvious changes, but maybe I was calmer, and if I do this for a longer period of time, it's entirely possible that it would impact that. So let's conclude here. What do we take away from this? So we learned that if you want to, in order to put yourself in a place of, in as good a place as you can in order to thrive, you want to apply some of the techniques. You want to be in a place where positive psychology and the things we talked about in PERMA are a part of your life, right? And that's great. It's not only for people who are already optimists, because a lot of this can be learned. There are specific techniques that you can apply in order to learn this. It's probably, in my opinion, it's not like a switch that you flip. It's something that you have to develop over time and you have to commit to. It can be trained. And for training it, you probably need some willpower, but that too can be trained. So there's sort of a lot of things emerging that I think can make us hopeful. And with that, I will conclude and take any questions, and thank you for your attention this morning.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, Katharina. I'm desperate to have my son watch that talk because he's the most negative person you've ever met. So we do have questions, because this is a hybrid conference, we'll do in-person questions as well as people who are online. Feel free to swap to the chat tab and post your questions there, and they will reach me and I can ask them. So can we start with any questions in the audience?
Hi, Katharina. Thank you very much for the talk. One question I had around purpose was, how much in the research that you've looked at, do you attribute purpose to the role or the craft that a person plays, so managing or being a software engineer, compared to the organisation that they live within? And like, how do you, both you and from maybe some of the research you've looked at, attribute that purpose back to, is it the craft that I'm doing or is it the organisation that I work for?
Yeah. So I'm not an expert on what the literature says here, I must say, but a little bit of what I've read, and I can tell you what I'm observing a lot, is that it's really a mix. Like, some people are much more motivated by and find more purpose in their craft. Like, they're really great at programming, right, for instance, and they want to be really, really good at it and be experts, and that's this mastery concept that we talked about. And this is unscientific, but what I find around me is that the more senior people get, the more they think about also the bigger context, right? Like, okay, so I talked about cloud computing, public cloud, and why does that matter? And so, one of the interesting things that I found as a leader is that you actually, when you talk to your teams, you need to tailor that a little bit. You need to kind of tease out what motivates them, because for a long time I'm like, what we do matters so much to the company, to this organization, and here's why this matters, and here's the bigger picture, and they're like, okay, I'd like to go and write some interesting code now, right? And that's okay too, right? Because ultimately it all fits together, but I think tailoring this is really important. So I've seen both.
Okay, we have an online question from Reese Campbell. Is there an obvious line between not stretching yourself enough, i.e. pending regret, and pushing yourself too hard, i.e. burnout? How can we identify that sweet spot so that we can continue to progress happily?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think, burnout can come from in my view, from two places. One is the role that you're in, that you're given, you're being put under too much pressure. Maybe you're in a role where you're too much on the anxiety side. And that can, over time, and there's just like too much work and you can't deliver it and you're being pushed out of your comfort zone. And I've also seen people burn themselves out, right? Like, they constantly want to push themselves and they burn themselves out. Is there an obvious red line? I don't know. There are obviously signs of burnout that we have to pay attention to. When people, one of the things that I always, pay really close attention to is actually when people focus much more on the negative, right? So you see them being productive and kind of actually engaged and happy, and then you see them like shift and focus much more on, this person said that and that made me unhappy, and I didn't like this interaction, and this piece of code that I'm reviewing is bad, and things like that. So to me, that is one sign that I pay attention to, but I think there's lots.
Thank you. I was going to ask about flow. So I think I'm keen to get your perspective on like the modern workplace and how you can get teams into flow and then keeping them in flow. And I think how things like Agile practices and all those ceremonies and meetings and open offices and all those kind of distractions can take you very much out of that flow, and just keen to get your thoughts on strategies to do it.
Yes. It's I think what's interesting about this, there are no magic solutions, and people try to do a lot of that. I think being aware of it is a good first step, because, sorry, I'm supposed to stay on that side. Is a good first step, because most people aren't. Like, most leaders and managers are not aware of this, and they just stuff meetings everywhere. And like you said, it can really take you out of the moment, and then it takes a long while to get back into it. And furthermore, a lot of the people who attend those meetings don't necessarily need to be there, and the meetings aren't very meaningful. And so that's actually really bad. So I in my organization, I do try to be mindful of that. And have blocks of time where people have time to be very heads down. And I definitely encourage that. For myself, what I do is I try to keep 1 day a week largely empty of meetings, and I hold pretty firm on that, which is hard, but it really helps me do that.
Okay, our online people have gone quiet, so I think there was one over here.
So I've just got a question about your leadership styles. So you said that you manage around 100 people. Obviously, that's quite a large sort of team. I was wondering, would your leadership style change as the team gets larger, or do you think you would manage the same, or motivate your employees in the same sort of way for a smaller team?
Yeah, it definitely changes. So we can talk about that. I think when you manage 10 people, it's one thing, and it's sort of I've heard this described as like door-to-door salesmanship, right? Like you have lots of one-on-ones, and then once your team grows beyond a certain size, you maybe don't even know everyone on the team. Like you've never met them, and you don't necessarily meet them in meetings, and they're not in the same office, so maybe you don't know them. And so you have to definitely change your leadership style to be more broadcast-oriented in some sense. I think, however, that everybody has their leadership style to some extent that stays, right? So a lot of my interactions are with my direct reports, and then they lead their own teams. But as you can tell from this talk, I spend a lot of time thinking about human dynamics and how teams work together. And that doesn't mean that everything on my team is always, going really well. But that's a big emphasis of mine, and that's just built into my system. And that's not everyone, right? And so I think, like, even as your team grows, this is, different people still have different leadership styles that stay with them. And I think actually that's okay.
Thanks for the talk. I just wanted to ask, I like the delineation between like a hedonistic positivity and more of a pragmatic approach that's sort of more gradual. When people in your organisation have to express like a level of concern or something that's not necessarily instinctually positive, how do you approach them not impacting other people's positive mindset? Is there like a number one tip or something where they can, there's a safe space for them to be concerned as well?
Yeah. So this is actually a really great question. Thank you for the question. I think in any organization, and the larger the organization, the more often this happens for obvious reasons, is there are things that don't always go well. Like, there could be easy things like a delay in a project, or there could be things where two people don't get along, or whatever it may be. So my approach is always, number one, I want to know about it, right? And this is what I tell all my leaders, like, you're gonna wanna know what's going on in your organization. So sweeping things under the table is never the solution, right? Or under the rug, whatever, is never the solution. But the other thing I tell people is, think about what the solution might be, right? So we're definitely acknowledging something bad is going on, but what I don't encourage is people coming to me and just venting and like basically leaving it on my plate and then going off, right? And leaving it for me to solve, because I think it's up to everybody in the organization to help come up with solutions and help address those issues. So I think it's those two things combined.
Thank you. I was wondering, besides positive psychology, if you have any other principles in psychology that you use in your day-to-day work?
Let's see. So, I mean, I think there are a lot of different things a lot of the things kind of we touched on a little bit. The biggest one I would say is motivation, right? Motivation is like its whole other area, right? And you can read about it. And that's something where if you have teams that are motivated by what they do, either intrinsically because they care about the craft or whatever it may be, then you can, you know, a lot of things follow from that. A lot of good things follow from that. And then the other thing is just organizational. You know, there's like organizational psychology, right? It's just how do teams work together? How do organizations work together? Some people, you know, if you're cynical, you think of this as politics in an organization, but I think that's actually super critical, right? So to me, it always comes back to what are people incentivized to do? What are they motivated by intrinsically? And so I do spend a lot of time thinking about those kinds of things as well.
Thank you for your talk. I really liked your example of the hedonistic treadmill you mentioned about, you know, setting goals, your marathon, and being happy with it, and knowing what you don't want. You don't want to go to Boston. Do you have any tips or hints around being able to set those goals and being content when you do hit them?
I mean, the only thing that I can say is you have to set them ahead of time. Like, you can't say, I'm going to get to this goal and then I'm going to say it's enough. That doesn't work for me. So it has to be like ahead of time before I say, this is the goal I'm going to reach and I'm not going to reach for this other goal. And then just keep reminding myself of, no, that's what I told myself. I was going to say that's enough. And, you know, now that it's funny because you just said Boston, I'm like, well, deep down, I kind of still do want to do that, but maybe later. So it's a constant struggle, but, you know, it really helps to just say, you know what, it is deprioritized, at least for right now, for the next number of years, until my kids are in college, it's not a thing, right? So ahead of time. Like to sit down like right now and say, you know, where do I want to get to in my career? Where do I want to get to in whatever ambition I have? Right.
Probably got time for one more. Yep.
I was just going to say, I really liked the part with willpower about how it's it's about the forgiveness of yourself when you don't have that perfect day. And I also think that that's really useful when you consider it about a goal is achieved or not achieved, whereas a target is about taking aim. And I think that was a super useful analogy. My question around having psychology being really targeted around having people work up to a baseline where positive psychology is going beyond that. Do you have a strategy or an approach when you're talking about a workplace where not everyone is at a baseline, not everyone is at that positive psychology level, and some people will have greater resilience to things going wrong, both personally and professionally? Do you think about this at an individual level, or do you think about it at more of a workplace level where the workplace is at a baseline? And when people aren't in that positive psychology space, how do you identify that and then help bring them back to that baseline to then reinforce that positive psychology aspect?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question, right? Because, you know, I'm not a mental health professional, and what I will say is that there is sort of this place right below what you would call baseline, somebody doing really well, where you try to intervene and you try to, as a manager, you try to kind of tease out what's happening and how can we address these issues. But I will say that, and this is the recommendation I would give to everyone, is, don't be shy about involving, the people whose professional lives are dedicated to that. So in our case, this is HR, and then we have different resources at Google that help people with mental illness. Like, we see, people taking time off and things like that. And like, you definitely see the signs as your manager where you're like, this isn't, this doesn't fall in the healthy category. And I definitely make sure I get HR involved and the right professionals, because that's not something you can mess with. Right.
That was an awesome Q&A. Thank you very much, Katharina.
Thank you.